We're now on Daf Chafov Amid Beis, and we're introducing a sugya in mikvos, which is called hashaka. The problem is when you have water that was makabel tuma, and now you want to be metired in a mikvah, you can't just pour it into the mikvah because then you don't find the water, you don't have the water. So you do is hashaka. You put the water into a kli, and you um, how do you say in English, lashkia, and you submerge that utensil into the water to the point at which the top layer of the water, the mikvah, equals the top layer of this kli, is mashiko b'mayim. If we're talking about temed before it fermented, then it's mayim. And if it's mayim, it lends itself to hashaka. However, mishehichmitz, once it's considered yayin because it already fermented, then ein mashiko b'mayim, meaning the halacha of hashaka, the mechanism of tara and a mikveh through hashaka only operates with regard to mayim, not yayin. And if I had to take a stab at it, why is this so? I would say that if you have this combination of temed with sediments and water, maybe the sediments float to the top and the water to the bottom. It's not a real good hashaka. Omar Rava says the following: Lo shanu el shetimdo b'mayim tahor v'nitmu. So Rava is coming now to qualify the brisa. The brisa says, again, let's go over this, that before the fermentation process is clinched, you can subject temed to hashaka as mayim. It has status of mayim. Says Rav, Avol tmeim meikara lo. If let's say he took mayim tmeim and he poured it into the sediments and let it settle down, then hashaka is impossible. So the Gemara says, I don't get it. There's no consistent logic here in Rava. Also, Rav Gvir Beik Seal Amal Shmaita Kamedu Rav Ashi. Maishnot me kara delo. What's your problem if the water initially, before you poured the sediments into the water, was already tameh, and therefore it's mufka, it's excluded from hashaka, the amrinan aidi de maya yekire, shachne tatoi. What we're going to say is that the propensity or the weight of the mayim in relationship to the sediments is heavy, heavy meaning it sinks to the bottom, and the fruit element, meaning the sediment element, rises to the top. And therefore, the hashaka cannot be operative because the hashaka is not with mayim. Because what's on top now is not mayim, but rather the sediments and the grape seeds. The mayim is sunk to the bottom. Uperi kafu miliel. The fruit element here, or extract, floats to the top. So the hashaka process will not really impact on the mayim. But what does that have to do with Tommy Meikara or not Tommy Meikara? Ihachi, if that be the case, Tahor V'sof Nitmu Nami. You're going to have the same exact problem if the water was tar from square one. Because once again, you tell me that the water sinks to the bottom and the temed goes on to the top, and there's no hashaka of the mayim. Ella, the only way you can understand this halach of hashaka in the case of temed is mevalbale, right? We have to assume that somehow the water and the fruit extract together gets mixed up and they're blended together. They're integrated into one whole. It's not like one top that floats to the top and one on the bottom. It's hachinami, and therefore the same thing should apply even if the water was meikara, was initially tameh. It's going to be the same issue. So therefore, if you're already validating hashaka in a case where the original state of the mayim was tar, you have to logically apply that consistently to the case where it was originally tamid. And the Gemara doesn't seem to defend Rava here at this point, but the Mefarshim are going to try to see what Rava would argue against Rav Gavir. The Gemara doesn't mention this. So this leads us to the Mishnah here on the top of Daf Chavav Amid Beis. And again, we're looking for the contrast and the flip side. Kol makom sheish mecher ein knas. Kol makom sheish knas ein mecher. So let's introduce this by saying that a young girl is subject to three different halachas, three different categories. What's the plural of status? Three different stati, if there's such a word. Anyway, the first status is a katana. Actually, katana itself divides up into two, excuse me. So all told there are four, but okay, let's leave it at that. So katana, so that's from birth until the age of 12. Then there's Nara, which is 12 to 12 and a half. And then there's Bogeres after she's 12 and a half. Okay. Now, these distinctions are relevant to two different halachas. One is called Knas, and the other is called Mecher. Mecher has to do with the father's rights that are granted to him by the Torah to sell his daughter as what's called an Amma Ivriya. And she becomes an Ovavriya up until the point when she's a Nara until she's 12. So his ability to sell his daughter as an Ovavriya terminates when she reaches Narus, which is the age of 12, and she has two Saras. Then there's halach of Knas in a case where Nebuchadnezzar was raped, and he has to pay 50 shekel Knas to the father. So the Mishnah says the following. What we're learning now is the sheet of Rabbi Meir. Kol mokum sheish mecher ein knas, kol mokum sheish knas ein mecher. So it means the following, that if the father has the ability to sell her according to the Jewish law, then the boel, the ma'anis, doesn't pay knas. If, on the other hand, the ma'anis has to pay knas, then the father's right to sell her as an amma is completely removed. And Omer Rabbi Yehuda Marav, Zu Divrei Rabbi Meir, V'chachom Omer Yesh Knas Mocham Mecher. Okay. So we're going to see the machlokas now between Rabbi Meir and Chacham. Desanya, we learned to the Brisa. Now this Brisa introduces first and foremost the Shita of Rabbi Meir. Ktano mibas yom echad ad shetovi gimel saros, yesh lo mecher v'yein lo knas. So up until the age of 3, halachically, legally, according to Jewish law, there's no bia. And therefore, the knas for a boel is inapplicable. However, from the moment she's born, the father has the rights to sell her as an omevriya. Now, mishitavi beis saros ad shetibog. Now we're in the period of narus, from 12 to 12 and a half, is yesh lo knas, v'yein lo mecher. It's just the opposite now. Here's where she will collect knas from the boel, but since she's a nara, she's yotza mishus avia, and the father can't sell her divrei Rabbi Meir. So if we go over this one more time, what we come out is that knas and mecher are mutually exclusive, because in the case of mecher, we're talking up until narus. And according to Rabbi Meir Shita, there's no knas for a boel until she becomes a nara. Now, once she becomes a nara, okay, the knas is imposed on the boel, and the father will, okay, that's the sugi and ksubis, whether the father collects the money or she collects money. But anyway, ein lo mecher. So again, just to summarize, Rabbi Meir holds that knas and mecher are mutually exclusive. However, the Brisa records the Shita of the Chachamim, and they hold that Ktana mibas gimel shonim v'yom echad sheti boger yesh lo knas. Now, what that means is that during this period of time, from 3 years and up, because before 3 years there's no knas, because there's no bia, she's not ruya l'bia. But from 3 and on, which certainly, according to Chachamim, like we saw in Rabbi Meir, is yesh mecher, he could sell her as an omevriya, but not all that, but the Chacham hold yesh lo knas. In other words, knas and mecher are not mutually exclusive, they overlap. Although Mecher begins with her birth, Knas is delayed until she's 3 years old. But from the age of 3 and on, there's both Knas and Mecher. There's an overlap of both. And that's where the Gemara clarifies here. Knas in, Mecher lo. No, Ema af Knas v'moko Mecher. So let's just summarize the sheet of the Chacham. From birth to the age of 3, there's Mecher, but no Knas, because there's no Bia. Number 2, from the age of 3 up until Naris, until 12, then he has both Mecher and Knas, right? Both Mecher and Knas. Now, we enter into Narus, and in Narus, which means that the 6-month period between 12 and 2 Saras and 12 and a half, then he doesn't have a right to sell her because once she's a Nara, she's Bershus Atzma. Financially, she's independent of her father, but there's still a Knas. But that's not the point. Again, there are periods in time, according to Chachamim, where there's Knas without Mecher and Mecher without Knas. But the overlap in the age between 3 years and Narus is, according to Chacham, she has both Knas and the father has Mecher. This leads us to the next Mishnah. And this Mishnah introduces another concept in Ishus, which is called Miyun. And Miyun means that if she doesn't have a father to sell her or to marry her off, then her mother or her brothers can marry her off. And that's Kiddushin D'Rabbanon, Ishus D'Rabbanon, that lends itself to Miyun. And the Mishnah establishes Kol Mokum Sheish Miyun, as long as she's young enough so the marriage is not recognized on a Dorais, on a Torah level, she could be Mamayin. But Ein Chalitza, she's too young for Chalitza in event that her husband died before she had any children. And the flip side is Kol Makom Sheish Chalitza. If she's old enough to have Chalitza, then Ein Miyun. She's out of the box as far as Kedusha D'Rabbanan for Kedusha Miyun. She can't just walk out of the marriage and say, I refuse to be married to this guy, because now it's already Kedusha Torah. I mean, there's a whole sugya here that we're not even touching on. Did they have Bia, after she became a Gedola? Anyway, Omer Rabbi Yehuda Marav Zu Divrei Rabbi Meir. Once again, the Mishnah reflects Rabbi Meir, like Stam Mishnah Rabbi Meir. Aval Chacham Omer Yesh Miyun B'Makom Chalitza is an overlap between Miyun and Chalitza. This is a big chiddush here. How could there be an overlap? I mean, Miyun is only Kedusha Ketana, and Chalitza is only when she became a Gedola. But the Sanya Ad Masay Abasma Ma'enes, according to Rabbi Meir, Ad Shetovish Te Saras, meaning once she's a Gedola, she's a Nara, then there's no miyun. The Kiddushin is Doraisa, it doesn't lend itself to miyun. But Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Achi Yarbe Hashachar Lavan. So that's a period of time which is later than Narus, and nevertheless, according to Rabbi Yehuda, reflecting the sheet of the Chachamim, she could still be Mima'enes. And apparently, even though she's a Gedola, the Kiddushin remain Kiddushin D'Rabbanan, but you have to add a condition here. I don't know, he doesn't talk about it, that there was no Bia. Because if there was Bia, we have a principle called Stam Bia Kiddushin, Ein on Nosa Bia, Losa Bia listeners. All right. Anyway, now we get to the Mishnah about the overlap. I shouldn't say the overlap, because it's not exactly an overlap, but when you have Yontif and Shabbos, either Yontif on Friday, like we had just a few days ago, or Yontif on Sunday. And there were 3 blasts of the shofar as we entered into Kedusha and Isser Malacha. The first one was for the people out in the fields. It's late enough on Friday, you better start packing out of the fields and coming home. And then a little bit later, as we get closer to Shabbos, there was a second blast of the shofar, and that was for the geschäfts, meaning for the people who had market, in the market they were selling whatever they were selling, until finally, right before Shkia, there was a third shofar blast to tell everybody at Shabbos, and we can't do malach. And in Yerushalayim today, they reinstituted a little bit of that minhag, and they have sirens going off, and in some other cities in Israel. Anyway, the Mishnah says, "Kol makom sheish tkiya ein havdalah, kol makom sheish havdalah ein tkiya." So we have now another mutually exclusive situation of tkiya and havdalah. And what that means is that if there's a tkiya, now we're talking about, again, Yontif either on Friday or Yontif on Shabbos. And the tkiya, again, is going to indicate that we are going, let's say, like we had this past Friday, we're going from the Kedusha of Yontif, which is lower than the Kedusha of Shabbos that we're about to enter on Shabbos. So we need a tkiya to notify the people that we're going, that certain malachas that they were doing on Yontif were allowed, are not allowed on Shabbos, but we're not going to make Havdalah. Right? Havdalah is recited when you leave Shabbos. Here you're not leaving Shabbos. You're leaving Yontif, but you're entering into a higher level of Kedusha, more intense Kedusha, and therefore there's no Havdalah. If, on the other hand, there is Havdalah, like let's say, for example, you leave Shabbos, then although you're entering into Yontif, if Yontif is on a Sunday, we don't blow the shofar because you're already into Shabbos and you're used to the Yisr Malach. Now, Yontif Shechalil's Be'erev Shabbos. We go back to our case this past Friday. Tokim v'lo mavdilin, as we said before, we're entering into a higher, more intense Kedusha of Shabbos with much more, wider, broader Isa Malach, and therefore we needed Tekiah. But we're not going to make Havdalah, because again, we're going to a higher level of Kedusha. Motzai Shabbos. Now, let's say Yontif is on a Sunday, and our Motzai Shabbos Mavdilin. Why? Because we're going from a higher level of Kedusha to a lower, and that's called Hamavdil Ben Kodesh LeKodesh. But Velo Token, right? We're already in that mode of Isa Malach of Shabbos. We don't have to be Tokeah. Now the Mishnah goes into what I call Matbeah Shel Brachos, which means a discussion about, what and when should you recite in the Havdalah when you go from Shabbos to Yontif, meaning Yontif is on a Sunday. Ketzam Avdilin, Hamavdil Ben Kodesh LeKodesh. You can't say Hamavdil Ben Kodesh LeChol because you're not entering into Chol because that Sunday is Yontif. And Rabbi Dosa Omer Ben Kodesh Chomer LeKodesh HaKal. The Gemara says that the Chacham weren't excited about the formula, the Matbeah of Rabbi Yosef, because it's a little bit insulting to Yontif to use the term Kodesh Hakal. It's like light, light Yontif. Anyway, the Gemara asks, Hechi Tokea. So now we're talking about the case where Yontif was on Friday, like our case a few days ago. And we do want to make some difference here between the classic Friday Tekiyos and the Tekiya on Yontif for Friday. How exactly do we make that change? Rabbi Yehuda, there's machlokas. Rabbi Yehuda says Tokea Miriya Mitoch Tekiya, meaning you don't even take a breath, but rather you go from Tekiya into Trua. And Rav Asi Omer, no, Tokea, take a breath, Umeriya B'neshima Achas. But what does it mean, B'neshima Achas? B'neshima Achas means that he doesn't have a pause in between. He just takes like, let's say, a small pause. So it turns out that Rabbi Yehuda's sheet is more radical. We need a more radical indication of the Tekiya, of the change in the Tekiya. Asking Rav Asi Behutzel Kishmaita, Rav Asi went ahead and instituted, consistent with his Shita, that practice in Hutzal. However, the Gemara says we now have a brisa that seems to reject both Rav Yehuda and Rav Asi. Meisvei Yontif Shechalios Be'er Shabbos, like our case on Friday, Tokin V'lo Marian. There's no true at all. That's how radical of a change we have to do. My love lo marin klal lo. The Gemara says no. Rabbi Yehuda mitaritz the time. Rabbi Asi mitaritz the time. Rabbi Yehuda mitaritz the time. That lo marin b'fnei atzman ela mitoch hatkiya. Rabbi Asi mitaritz the time. Lo marin b'shtei neshimos ela b'neshima achas. So that even though, according to Rav Asi, as we said before, he doesn't take a pause, but he breathes. Next, the Mishnah says, Motzoi Shabbos Hechi Omer Lo. Right, what is this unique formula of Ben Kodesh LeKodesh in Havdalah Motzi Shabbos going into Yontif? Meaning, every bracha has two parts to it. It has a psicha and a chasima. Right, the Baruch Atah Hashem at the beginning of the bracha, and then the Baruch Atah Hashem at the end of the bracha. So where are we going to place Baruch Hamavdu Ben Kodesh LeKodesh? Omer Rabbi Yehuda b'Chasimosa. According to one shita, we're not going to change the opening part that says Hamavdu Ben Kodesh Ben Yom Hashvi L'Sheish Maseh, which again is technically inappropriate because it's not Sheish Maseh. We're going into Yontiv. But Rabbi Yehuda and Rav Nachman insist that we don't change the psicha. Psicha remains holy of holy. We'll have to see why. But Rav Sheshes prayed Rav Idiomar psichasa. If you're going to be consistent here, and because you're going into Yontif after Shabbos, therefore you say Ben Kodesh LeKodesh, then you should start the bracha. Leave out Ben Shivas Yimei, Ben Shivas Yimei Maseh, and rather introduce Ben Kodesh LeKodesh for less Hilchos HaKodesh. But we don't accept the shita of Rav Sheshes. Now, why don't we accept the shita of Rav Sheshes? So here we have an explanation of Rashi and the Tiferes Yaakov. I'm laughing because you know what the Tiferes Yaakov's last name was, his family name? Steve, did you sneeze? Well, let's make believe you sneezed. Gesundheit. His name was Rav Yaakov Gesundheit. Harei and Ikiv and Shivim Shon, I never met a man with the last name Gesundheit. But the Tiferes Yaakov was Gesundheit. Anyway, why does the Gemara reject Rav Sheshes? Because Rav Sheshes made a mistake. The psicha is not describing the situation today, but right, thanking Hashem for what he created in the abstract world. Namely, that we're praising Hashem for the difference between the 6 days of mundane weekdays and the holy days of Shabbos. So it doesn't matter whether we're entering into those 6 days of mundane chol, because that's just a general kind of shevach HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Anyway, let's go on. And here we're going to make a siyum on Akol Shochtim. Rabbi Dosa Omer Ben Kodesh Chabur LeKodesh Kal V'les Hilchos HaKavosei. We don't accept this kind of description of Yontif as kal. It's like light. Omer of Zera, but Zera says, Yontif Shechalios Be'emtza Shabbos. Now we have Yontif during the week. Is Omer Hamavdil Ben Kodesh L'chol. Okay, that Havdalah makes sense because we're going from Yontif into Chol. Ben Or L'choshech. Ben Yisrael or Amim, Ben Yom HaShvi L'Sheish Masa. You see when it says Yom HaShvi L'Sheish Masa, which is not really true because we're in Yontif, which is the middle of the week. It's not Shabbos. So it's not Yom HaShvi. My timer, say there Havdalas Humona. As we said before, we're only thanking Hashem for creating all these different Havdalos, these different separations between Kodesh L'Chol, between the 6 days of Masa and the 7th day, which is Shabbos. But it's not relevant to this particular moment in time. Hadron Alecha Kol Shochtin. We'll just begin very quickly. The next parak, which is the second parak of Chullin on Daf Chav Zayin, Shoched Echad Ba'of. With regard to Of, you only have to shecht one of the two simanim. And Shnayim B'Behema, but in an animal, you have to shecht both simanim, the trachea and the esophagus. That's mean the kon and the veshet. and shchitas ksheira. In this case, shchitas ksheira means that's the way you have to do it, even lechatchila. But rubo shel echad kamohu, if let's say he cuts most of that simon, whether it be one simon in the case of oaf or most of two simonim in the case of bema, then it's okay. We're going to see later on that that's already b'diavad. That's not the best way of doing it. And Rabbi Yehuda has in Ophos a whole new element that he adds to the shechita, and that is Hachiyishchot es havridim. He has to sever the main blood vessels of the neck, which are called in English the jugular veins. The Rambam says, and he was a doctor in his Pirush HaMishnayos, that the vridin are the next to the neck, not next any XT, but any CK, the next two pulsating blood vessels on either side of the trachea, which are called the carotid arteries, the carotid arteries. Okay, fine. Next, Chatzi echad biof, if he only shechted half of a simon, in the case of an oaf, or echad v'chetzi, the second simon in a behema, which he had to shecht, he only did half of it, is shchitas psula. But rov echad biof, a rov shnai bebehema, shchitas ksheira. So the Gemara is going to try to figure out why the Mishnah had to repeat exactly word for word what it said at the Reisha. Okay, then, so this will stop for today. And tomorrow, I believe we get together at 9:30. Is that correct? Okay, have a great day. Thank you.